How'd you come to this story?
Well, to be honest with you, this is not a dramatic story. My original idea was to try to combine the stories of Louis Armstrong and Al Capone, to set something here in Chicago in the 20s, because I just love that era, and I love these two figures, and I felt like both of them were still kind of a little bit gray to me. I didn't feel like I really knew either man very well, and I'd read biographies of both Armstrong and Capone. So I thought, I wonder if there's a way to tell those two stories together. And I did some research and decided quickly that it wasn't working out.
Why not?
It felt forced to put the two of them together, and they knew each other a little bit, but I felt like they would have been two parallel stories, and maybe you could have done like an academic book on the influence of gangsters on the jazz age. You know, how I really believe that the speakeasies allowed jazz to flourish in Chicago in the 20s, and the fact that you had a guy as powerful as Capone putting these musicians to work helped the music to grow, but it wasn't my kind of book. And in the course of doing that research, I felt like the Capone story had more to offer than the Armstrong story. There was more potentially new ground to cover. And then very early, and this is one of the great lucks of reporting, I found some new documents that just blew me away.
What were those documents? They were about a guy that I, who sort of fashioned myself something of a Chicago historian, had never even heard of.
Yeah. This was, I was looking for my characters. I was trying to figure out who would be the characters in this story. And one of the characters I figured out would be a guy named George E.Q. Johnson. He was the prosecutor, the Patrick Fitzgerald of the 1920s.
How many of you have heard of him?
Heard of Johnson? Great.
Some smart guys here.
Yeah.
You read this book or no? You read it already?
He's up front. He's got some good questions for us in a little while. So I identified Johnson as a character, and then I set out to decide whether he was an important enough character that I could really build a book around him. I needed a balance to Capone. I knew that if I was going to write this book, it couldn't just be the fourth biography of Al Capone. It needed to be something else. It needed to have some other characters. It needed to have some tension. I wanted a book that would be a story and not just a straight biography, if I was even going to do it. I spent a year or so researching this. I had no idea whether I was going to undertake it. And in researching George E.Q. Johnson, he's an easy guy to search for, to do digital searches for, because that E.Q., those middle initials, which he made up because he wanted to distinguish himself from the other George Johnsons in the Chicago Swedish community. First he added the E, that wasn't enough, he added the Q. Anyway, I found in the Chicago Tribune a story from 1985 that his son talked about trying to find somebody to write his father's biography. His son was still alive at the time. Turns out he's still alive until just a few weeks ago he passed away, George E.Q. Johnson, Jr. And he had said, in this article from the Tribune from 1985, he said that he had given all of his father's papers to a college professor in Nebraska, hoping that this college professor would write the biography of George E.Q. Johnson.
Capone comes here in 1920 and becomes the protege. There's a great, and I'll pick some things out of the book, not to read at length, but Johnny Torrio, then a leading mobster in Chicago, mentored him, and with the idea that he wanted him to carry himself, as John writes, with the air of a legitimate businessman. He had cards printed: Alphonse Capone, second-hand furniture dealer, 2220 South Wabash.
And I think it's interesting that he'd go second-hand.
Yes, right. Yeah, furniture dealer's not good enough. It has to be
very
even
modest,
more
very modest man.
Talk about the influence of Torrio on Capone. Comes here and he's basically a thug.
Yeah, he's 21 years old.
Yeah.
He's nothing. He's never been anything more than a bouncer.
Right.
And he doesn't really have any expectations of being more than a bouncer. But Torrio has been a gangster, a very high level for a long time, and he's sort of the class of the gangster world. He starts out in Brooklyn like Capone, comes to Chicago, takes over Big Jim Colosimo's operation when accidentally someone shoots Big Jim behind the ear. And Torrio's the guy who understands that this can be a business. And certainly when Prohibition starts and you've got this enormous influx of money, it can be a big business. So Torrio's the one with the vision. Capone really is at that point an intern. He's along for the ride. He's waiting to see what's going to happen.
When he comes here, the whole notion of, characterized for me the notion of, and I'm not even sure it was, of organized crime in 1920.
Yeah, it was not very well
chaotic.
Organized. Yeah. These were gangsters. These were low-level thugs. They were bootleggers only after Prohibition came along. Before Prohibition came along, they were just thugs. They were safecrackers and pickpockets. And in Torrio's case, he was a little bit higher up the ladder than most because he saw that Big Jim Colosimo had this operation where he employed prostitutes. He had gambling going on in various places, and he saw the potential to grow that business. Colosimo wanted no part of growing it. He was happy to have his restaurant. He liked the celebrity attention that he got. But when Prohibition came along, there was opportunity to expand that exponentially, and it was Torrio who had that vision.
So, in essence, Prohibition provided this kind of nurturing ground for this latent, hidden entrepreneurial abilities of someone like Capone and Torrio.
That's right. You had this chance to make an unbelievable amount of money. Think about it. One of the 10 biggest industries in America is declared illegal, and you've got enormous businesses just giving it up. You've got whole breweries, whole distilleries going out of business. You've got whole vineyards out in California just shutting their doors. Some of them decide that they're just going to go into the production of sacramental wine because there's an enormous market suddenly for sacramental wine. But for guys like Capone and Torrio who are not afraid of breaking the law, there's a chance to move in and take this over and really. They know the guys who can do this. They know guys who can drive trucks. They know guys who can break legs. They're well positioned.
John writes in the book, which again is called Get Capone, the secret plot that captured America's most wanted gangster. Torrio and Capone were like explorers, sailing off in uncharted directions, taking wrong turns, and, when necessary, slaughtering the natives who got in their way. Slaughter, I dare say, is not a leitmotif of this book. It's a motif of this book. Talk to me about that kind of the viciousness and the. It was all business, because I think it stands in stark contrast to the way that gangs operate in contemporary Chicago, kind of indiscriminately, lots of drive-bys that kill innocent people. This was all about business, was it not?
It really was. And I think the key is that these gangsters quickly realized that the business was great in many respects. The police were easily bribed, very inexpensively. The courts were easy to take care of. Capone gets arrested for drunk driving in 23, and he just laughs.
Yeah.
You know, I'll be out of this. I'll have this thing dismissed before I even sober up. And he does. So the really only problem with this smooth operation of this incredibly enriching activity is the other gangsters. So Torrio is really a guy who tries to make peace with the others, but it's hard. You know, this is a messy business. You're dealing with a lot of uneducated guys, goons who are just used to punching guys out when they encounter a problem. So violence does tend to flare up from time to time. But Capone and Torrio really understand that either you get rid of them or you make peace with them. You can't really operate in that gray area, and that's where the killings come in. And there's really very few. There's very little collateral damage. It's gangsters killing gangsters.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing that I think intrigues many of you. May be mob fans, but tell me I'm wrong about this. That these guys and the outfit as we know it do operate on a very strict moral business code. It may be totally skewed and criminal, but it's a code that we all can understand. I mean, you look at Enron. That's one of the appeals of this whole world, don't you think?
Yeah, and this is the days when organized crime was almost charming because they were just starting out. They were trying to keep this thing going as long as they could, and these were men who were not had not for very long been perceived as vicious. They were perceived as lowlifes, guys who were willing to break the law to support their families, but only later did they come to be seen as monsters. And in their own minds, they didn't perceive themselves as vicious criminals. They were just trying to get as rich as they could, as fast as they could, and to kill as few people as necessary.
You make a point in here that there is something. And I think the press is greatly to blame for burnishing the legend of and the reality of Al Capone. But there was and had to be some kind of great charm to this person. Is that the right word to use, John?
I think in his own way, Capone was a fairly charming character, and this is hard for people to imagine. But the reason he finds success in the first place, I believe, is that he has skills as a people person. He's very good working the floor of the bar. He's very good greeting customers, talking sports, telling jokes. Damon Runyon, who was a very good judge of character, loved this guy.
Yeah.
And the Capone family to this day still believes that many of the characters in Guys and Dolls are based on the Capone brothers.